going on, guys? Smarty here, and welcome to Smarticus. First off, I just want to say thank you guys for coming on over and giving this a chance, so to speak, because this is something I always like doing. Now that that's out of the way, I think it's time we go ahead and recap some of my favorite games of the year. So let's go ahead and play off some of the honorable mentions that just didn't make the cut, but they do deserve to be on this list. Take it away. I'm sorry. Anyway, so let's go ahead and start off with number 10 on this list. Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number is an interesting beast of a game, very different for a sequel. I mean, the feeling of reality splitting in two is the same as it feels as the first game, but the narrative of Hotline Miami 2 is something that really caught my attention. While the first game was centered around a mask-donning protagonist murdering people and stopping operations run by the Russian mafia, Hotline Miami 2 sends you back and forth between dozens of characters and locations. At one moment, you're a journalist in a subway station trying to use non-lethal takedowns to fight your way out, and at another, you're a soldier using a flamethrower to incinerate enemy forces in Hawaii. There's a lot of diversity in the story as well as level design and weaponry. I think what really makes this game, though, is the new soundtrack. Hotline Miami's soundtrack is key to its memorability, and the second game is no exception. All three elements, soundtrack, gameplay, and graphics, are married so well together. Tied with the short and properly difficult experience really makes this game a gem of the year. Mario Maker is just straight up fun, pure and nostalgic fun. At first I thought it was gonna be some cash in on the Mario franchise, seeing as it was the 30th anniversary, but honestly it's the creativity and the community that made this game worth the purchase. And you know, I've learned some people are dedicated to the craft of making difficult levels. That or they're just all sadomasochists. Probably that. Yeah, definitely that. But the extent of levels you can create in Mario Maker is endless. Plus the 100 life run mode is always fun and challenging, seeing as all the levels you get are randomly generated. My only crux with it is it tends to get very old very fast, but then again, if you look hard enough, Mario Maker will always have something new to offer. Fun for the kids while still being a reminder of the past for the older crowd. Ori and the Blind Forest may officially have the saddest opening to a video game. No, seriously, the first 10 minutes remind me of a movie like Up. No dialogue, just the visual representation of sadness. Speaking of visuals, the visual style of Ori and the Blind Forest is something like I've never seen before in a video game. Reminds me heavily of a Hayao Miyazaki flick in all the right ways. Same goes for the awesome orchestral score. Ori and the Blind Forest may be one of the most clever, intricate Metroidvania games I've ever played, up there with Axiom Verge, where a quick trigger finger and perfect timing are almost as important as exploring its secret-filled environments. And those are pretty important. Now, my only gripes about Ori is the game could be a little too frustrating, specifically in some of the later scenes, but overall, the platforming, the atmosphere, and the story really take all of that and throw it out the window. Do yourself a favor and pick up Ori and the Blind Forest when you can. It's probably one of the better platformers of the year. Now that Max Caulfield's excellent adventure is all out there on the table, I'd like to think that as a whole, it was pretty solid. Taking inspiration from Telltale Games and their style, it's about making critical decisions which will impact your own story in the end, shaping how Max interacts with the world around her and the problems that come with teenage life. Best friends, cliques, bullies, and a lot of surprisingly real shit. Not to spoil anything, but there are a few moments in the game where touchy topics rear their ugly head, and it's fucking astounding to think that they would cross that line. The story of Life is Strange is really good with the exception of the final chapter, which is why it's so high on this list. Unfortunately, it kind of falls apart narrative-wise and choice-wise because honestly, some of the decisions you make don't have a justifying means to an end. The visual representation of Life is Strange is... Don't take this wrong, it's It's nothing special, it's hard to really describe, it doesn't really pop out, yet it manages to have its own signature style that, basing this on the atmosphere of the game itself and the soundtrack, it works. It's trying to be more like this quirky indie film like Juno or Nick and Nora's Infinite Playlist, something like that. And one more thing, speaking of quirky, some of the dialogue in this game is cringy as all hell. It's almost as if someone saw a group of teenagers in a movie and assumed that all teenagers in America talk like this. With that said, Life is Strange is an emotional coming-of-age story with tons of twists and turns that really tug at your heartstrings. It's worth it to check out for the story you receive and the decisions you make. I saw this game at last PAX East and I was hooked instantly. Titan Souls, a game very reminiscent of games like Shadow of the Colossus, puts an emphasis on intensity. With every enemy you face, the more you feel as if you're fighting a David and Goliath style battle that you might not win. Every precise shot you make in this game counts and makes you feel the mortality of the main protagonist. On another note, I am a huge fan of games with a retro look, like 16-bit style art in games. And that being said, this game looks beautiful for that. These are the kind of games that when I think of the term indie games, this is what I think of. With intense yet simple gameplay, fluid controls, and a short but satisfying experience that leaves you wanting to get better in the next playthrough, Titan Souls is a game you won't ever forget. Rocket League, to me, is probably the most addicting multiplayer game I have ever played. A simple concept of soccer with cars couldn't be a more intense and enjoyable experience. When I knew this was going to be a fantastic game, it was a few days after release, and I had heard nothing about it. Now that DLC modifiers have been included into the game, I'd like to think that the game got 20 times better with the variety of game types that can be made. Low gravity, high gravity, instant murder, no murder. The arena is your metaphorical oyster. It's surprisingly intense and in general has been the most fun I've ever had in a long time when it comes to video games. Batman Arkham Knight is probably my favorite of the series for multiple reasons. First off, Rocksteady was back in the helm for this game, meaning it would be refreshing after Arkham Origins. Second off, as an open world game, it's one of the best I've played in a long time. You get to just roam around Gotham City, beating up bad guys and righting wrongs. Third, Arkham Knight is honestly the darkest and grittiest in the franchise. It pulls no punches with its story, and it's violent in all the right ways. And last but not least, Scarecrow is the villain in this game, and he's actually menacing this time. It makes me so happy to see them use the character in more than just a stealth platforming minigame. This game is just a joy to play. Arkham Knight is well animated, beautifully designed, and it happens to be super fluid and smooth to control. Take, for example, zipping to higher locations, gliding around the city, or even the game's signature combat system. And speaking of, you can honestly see the vast improvements in the combat system in comparison to the past games. With this new game, I do have a few problems, of course, with it. For example, while it's nice to drive around the city in the Batmobile, it kind of feels like they give you excuses to use it by cramming it down your gullet via side quests, or puzzles, or what have you. I mean, the option's nice, but when you're forced to drive, it could be a pain in the ass. Also, puzzles could be a bit tedious and have a tendency to take you out of the atmosphere of Gotham itself. But honestly, this game was fun through and through. It nicely wraps up the Arkham series, and I think it's definitely one of the best open world games I've ever played. Well, if it wasn't for number 3 on this list. I'd like to say that Metal Gear Solid 5 managed to successfully transform the series from a stealth action gameplay franchise, you know, like it usually was, to an open world adventure. The game picks up immediately after the final moments of its prologue, Ground Zeroes. You find yourself as Big Boss coming out of a 9-year coma, and while things are nice and quiet at first, it suddenly turns on a dime, probably becoming some of the most heart-pounding and memorable moments in a video game. It's rare when a tutorial sequence can leave you on the edge of your seat. Once you're thrust into the game itself, you can choose whether to take on the game's main story missions, tackle side ops, or just mosey about the expansive regions of Afghanistan and Africa. I would go about saying that this game is one of the best looking video games of all time, plus the soundtrack being filled with many a memorable tune from the 80s. It makes the experience so much better. Now, while some people, including myself, do think that this game was hyped up a little too much, I do think that as a send-off to the series, Hideo Kojima and his team did a magnificent job bringing the story full circle. And speaking of, now that he has his own production company going for him with Sony, I'm pretty sure that whatever he makes next is gonna live up to this Game of the Year contender. Undertale had probably the most sudden rise to critical acclaim that any game on this list could ever have. I mean, much like Randy motherfucking Orton, the admiration for this game came out of nowhere. In Undertale, you play as a human child as you navigate the fictional underground, a large secluded region underneath the surface of the earth. home to a diverse and intelligent group of monsters who have been banished from the surface following a war with humanity. On your quest to return to the surface, you will interact with a wide cast of characters, all lovable in their own way. However, throughout the game you'll be left to make a major decision, whether to kill or befriend them, which is a great game mechanic. Depending on the choices you make, the results will affect the outcome of a game to a large degree, with the dialogue and story outcome changing based on your decisions. But what really causes this game to stand out is the writing, because it has a weird sense of humor that really stuck with me. It could be lighthearted and smart, yet grim and dark as well. Plus, the writing for the characters really brings out that humor, and I really love the characters. There's something quirky about each of them that make them all lovable in their own way. Take for example the dynamic between the skeleton brothers Sans and Papyrus, or even the human hunting robot turned television star Metaton. Speaking of characters, I do love how even in the game's battle system, each enemy you face feels different. The battle system in Undertale is almost like a bullet hell minigame in nature, which is weird to play after roaming the underground, because honestly the world roaming aspect makes me feel like I'm playing an Earthbound hack. I feel like variety is the underlying theme of Undertale, and honestly you can determine that, and honestly that could be perfectly displayed throughout the soundtrack. Like, do me a favor, listen to Hopes and Dreams, Death by Glamour, and Megalovania back to back to back, and tell me that this is from the same game. Because honestly, I wouldn't have guessed that. Undertale obviously has its faults. Take for example some of the puzzles. They have a tendency to wear out their welcome, specifically the Hotlands puzzles. Now, the main thing I need to stress about Undertale is it feels so much more than just an RPG Maker game. Undertale is a game that not only bears resemblance to games like Earthbound or Chrono Trigger, but took the JRPG genre, experimented with it, and brought it to a new place. Trust me, once you're a few hours in, it's gonna be worth the time invested. Come on, you should have expected this, guys. I was hyped up for Fallout 4 after I beat Fallout 3. It's one of my favorite games of all time. And as for Fallout 4, well, to me the hype delivered. Taking a lot of what I had problems with and very much improving them, well, with the exception of a few glitches here and there, but it's a Bethesda game, what do you expect? The tale of a man out of time has never been cooler as you go on a journey to find your son in a war-torn world. And speaking of the world, it wouldn't be a Fallout game if there wasn't a large cast of diverse characters that you can interact with. Depending of course who you talk to will shape your very own wander of the wasteland, thus giving you an interesting story to tell. And speaking of, the story of Fallout is what really got me, always challenging you to make compromises in order to survive. Also, now that we're in Boston, it's awesome to see what they did with a lot of the landmarks. Fenway Park becoming a giant city, the decaying USS Constitution, Bunker Hill, or even the thousands of Dunkin' Donuts that have been burnt down. Otherwise, being in close proximity to the Institute makes the lore that came with it much more terrifying. The game itself, minus the few aforementioned glitches, looks really good. It's one of the best looking games I've seen, and honestly when I first got my hands on it, I noticed that with a new engine, it feels like a mix between Fallout and BioShock Infinite with some of the newer animations. Granted, you could tell that they borrowed a little bit from Skyrim in the melee department, but it strangely works. To me, Fallout not only tops my list of games for 2015, but it definitely tops my list for favorite games of all time. Hey folks, so those were some of my favorite games of 2015. Did I miss anything on this list? How does your list work out? Feel free to let me know in the comments below. But for now, that wraps up another Smarticus video. I will be seeing you guys on the next episode. This is Smarty, signing off.